So now that we've explored the background of the kingdoms of Wales and the Roman withdrawal from Albion, we can now explore the historical figures from early Middle Ages Wales. But before that, we need to cover one individual who is connected to quite a few Welsh royal dynasties, and that is the Roman Emperor Magnus Maximus, or Maxen Ledig. Magnus was a Roman soldier from the Roman provinces in Hispania. In 380 AD, he was stationed in Roman Britain and successfully defended the Roman provinces there from the Picts in the north of modern-day Scotland. By 383, Magnus was proclaimed Roman Emperor and left Roman Britain with most of the garrison that was stationed there, and ruled in the western parts of the Roman Empire before being defeated by another rival in 388. Magnus surrendered, but was later executed by this emperor. There are many stories of legends involving Magnus in early Welsh history. One such story is called the Dream of Maxen Ledig, in which the emperor dreams of seeing an old king on his golden throne, and near him is a beautiful woman. Magnus awakes and begins his quest to find and marry this woman of his dreams, eventually finding her in Carnarvon. Magnus's name is later inscribed on the Pillar of Elysee, erected in the 9th century. Magnus is referred to as a king, and his daughter also married Vortigern, a Briton leader. But as we've shown, a connection to a Roman emperor for some Welsh kings is propaganda to link legitimacy, as he is also mentioned in the Welsh Triads, a collection of Middle Ages manuscripts dated around the 13th century. Geoffrey of Monmouth also makes use of Magnus in his fictitious story of the history of the kings of Britain. With the Roman Empire withdrawal, many kingdoms emerged from the vacuum of power and new settlements began to develop. Regarding the migration of Germanic peoples, some Germanics were already settled in Britain, as they fought for Rome as foederati, and it's been suggested that some Saxons and Frisians were offered to settle in the east of modern England by the Roman administration around 320 to 350 AD. But by the 5th century, according to Gildas, Britain was overrun by the Saxons, who he described as the vengeance of God upon the Britons for their sins, which is a typical condemnation of something you'll find in the Bible. But he does mention one man who he describes as a gentleman who, perhaps alone of the Romans, had survived the shock of this notable storm. Certainly his parents, who had worn the purple, were slain in it. His descendants in our day have become greatly inferior to their grandfather's excellence. Under him, our people regained their strength and challenged the victors to battle. The law dissented, and the battle went their way. Gildas names this man Ambrosius Aurelianus, or Ambrose Aurelian, and his tale is incredibly heroic, with an intriguing backstory. His parents were killed by the Saxons in their invasion. The theory is now that the Saxon invasion is now a migration, and whenever fighting occurred, it was more likely it was kingdoms fighting other kingdoms rather than Saxons versus Britons, with the only exceptions being raiding, like the one that was reported in 411 AD. Ambrose's origin is implied as part of the Roman Briton elite, as Gildas states his family won the purple, which means his family may have belonged to the aristocracy, giving him the authority of being a leader to help defend his people from the Saxons. If we look at the archaeological evidence of widespread destruction during the 5th to 6th century, one of our sources, The Kings and Queens of Wales by Timothy Venning, states, "It is now apparent from archaeology that there was less physical destruction in the 5th century that was supposed earlier. The physical destruction in towns, with a mixture of signs of fires and piles of body indicating violent attacks, is most apparent at 3 towns in the southeast, easy access to 5th century raiders: Colchester, Norwich, and probably Lincoln. These cases can be safely regarded as due to violence, and their geographical location would suggest the responsibility of seaborne invaders. The signs of violent destruction at Roman forts is only apparent at the smaller, isolated Yorkshire coastal lookout points that would have been vulnerable to seaborne Picts or Saxons. There are theories that Gildas created Ambrosius for a story for his contemporaries to follow and used Ambrosius as a glorious example. Gildas even condemns Ambrosius's descendants as having fallen to sinful ways. But there is also a theory that Ambrosius was a relative to Saint Ambrose, a bishop of Milan whose family was called the Ambrosi. The Historia Brittonum mentions a rivalry between Ambrosius and another Briton leader called Vortigern, but this account is dated around 820 to 850 AD and is attributed to a Welsh monk called Nennius, who himself is subject to legends. Gildas mentions a battle at Mons Badonicus or Mount Badon, which according to Gildas happened in the year he was born, 500 AD, and that the Britons won over the Saxons and peace was restored for about 50 years, but again Gildas comments that the Britons had fallen to their sinful ways. Gildas does not state that Ambrosius led this particular battle, but that he did defeat the Saxons in various engagements, which culminated at Mount Badon. Nennius offers this victory to Arthur, yet Gildas does not mention a Arthur at all. We do know by 490 AD many Anglo-Saxon settlements had been created, as archaeological evidence shows settlements around the Thames Valley, which would become the Kingdom of Wessex, so the idea of a battle against this new emerging kingdom or its people between a rival kingdom is justified, and one kingdom being possibly led by Ambrosius is an interesting story to tell. Vortigern is a complex name, as the name may have been a title rather than a personal name, as the word Vortigern appears in many stories and legends, and the name translates to overlord or overking in Brythonic. The name doesn't actually appear in Gildas's account. Gildas states, "Then all the councillors, together with that proud tyrant, the British king, were so blinded that as a protection to their country, they sealed its doom by inviting in among them, like wolves into the sheepfold, the fierce and impious Saxons, a race hateful both to God and men, to repel the invasion of the northern nations." Later accounts would link this Briton king as Vortigern. One of the stories tells us of how a proud tyrant and his council invited 3 ships of Saxons to Britain to fight for them against the Picts and other Celts, and to accommodate these new troops they were given land in eastern England, but would later make various complaints about the land, and would then start to raze and plunder in order to get what they wanted. Settlements were burned and left in ruins, and many Britons were killed or fled Albion. The Anglo-Saxon monk Bede tells us in his History of the English Church and People that the tyrant was Vortigern, but Bede's story tends to jump to a more legendary tale involving the 2 Saxon brothers, Hengist and Horsa, as Gildas again mentions no names of the Saxon leaders. Vortigern in Welsh history comes from the Welsh monk Nennius and the Historia Brittonum, and the name may have also come from the Latin of Vitalis or Vitalinus. Some Welsh traditions link him to Gloucester, where one of his ancestors originally came from. He has also been given the nickname in some Welsh tales as Gorthyn, the thin or repulsive, due to him speaking a Saxon language. Nennius lists him as one of the kings of Powys, as he fled there after the Saxon invasion and the betrayal at the peace conference. Nennius also tells us that this Vortigern fled to the left-handed parts of Wales, and Bede states the kingdoms of the Angles, Saxons and Jutes were established by 446 AD, but all our sources agree that there was no sudden Saxon takeover of Albion, and the theory is that most of Britain was held by the Britons for at least a century after the Roman withdrawal. A single specific Vortigern is difficult to pin down, simply for the many stories there are that involve someone of that name, and with Gildas being the closest source we have on the kings of Britain around that time.
As mentioned before, Gildas does not refer to a Vortigern at all, and later chroniclers, especially Geoffrey of Monmouth, contort a Vortigern to unimaginable levels of inaccuracy to suit either a specific need for a story or for propaganda purposes. Gildas and the Five Kings. As mentioned before, Gildas's angry sermon tells us about the loss of Britain to the Saxons, and in the second part of his work on the ruin and conquest of Britain, Gildas talks about 5 Briton kings, condemning them for their misrule and sinfulness, and calls them tyrants. The first king Gildas mentions is called Constantine, who he describes as the whelp of the unclean lioness of Damonia. This area is now modern-day Cornwall. Gildas chastises Constantine heavily and accuses him of the murder of 2 royal youths, and further accuses him of hanging their arms on the city gates. Gildas further mentions the sin of adultery and that Constantine committed the sin repeatedly, before advising him to repent unless he wants to kindle in hell. This suggests that this king was alive at the time of Gildas's writing and may have even read this condemnation. The next king Gildas targets is called Aurelius Coninu, who he accuses of the same sins as he did against Constantine, but that Aurelius was thirsting after civil wars and the spoils of war. Gildas again directly addresses Aurelius by reminding him of his parents and brethren who died in their youth. Gildas beseeches him that he should find salvation, or he will be tormented in hell. Unfortunately, Gildas does not tell us which kingdom Aurelius ruled. Vortigern is described as a spotted leopard whose head is now growing grey and who has committed a great many sins. Gildas quite cruelly notes that his end of life is now approaching by the day, and that his wife had an honourable death, and that he should spend what time he had left beseeching God for forgiveness. Vortigern was king of Dyfed, but that's all we know. Gildas was a prince of a small kingdom in the north of Wales that would be later incorporated into the kingdom of Gwynedd. Gildas unsurprisingly condemns him for his sins and for creating a great war against his own kin. Reading Gildas's writing, it seems the biggest sin committed is always adultery or the sin of lust. Gildas goes on to describe that Gildas needed to seek out and enter the true state of existence, or he shall suffer in the fires of hell. And our 5th king, who Gildas calls the most powerful and who had defeated the most tyrants and kingdoms, Maelgwn Gwynedd. Gildas states that Maelgwn exceeded many in power but also in malice, and that he stands above all for the amount of sins committed. Yet Maelgwn funded many religious building projects across Wales. He is also recorded as a great-grandson of Canada. Yet his death was due to what was called the Yellow Plague, which given the era around the 6th century may have been the plague of Justinian, which we now know is the bubonic plague.